Western world has adopted in terms of always having a human in the loop when it comes to lethal weapons. And so you won't have fully autonomous systems in that category. But we do expect that for the non-lethal missions, such as search and rescue missions, demining, whether it be in the sea or on land, or even just general surveillance for peacekeeping missions and those sorts of things, and for our military missions, I think we're going to see a lot more in the data processing to building situational awareness and decision aids, and it'll be coming in very quickly. So that's just touching on the beginning of it.
That's terrific. We're definitely going to hear a lot more from you. I'm going to hand over to Rem, though, and to pick up from that. And
right. So thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation and for this amazing venue. I should preface my comments by saying I'm not a futurologist. I'm a historian and a political scientist. And I think that when we talk about artificial intelligence, it's useful to look at some of the lessons that we've learned while studying and going through what we call previous revolutions in military affairs. And I think that they might be helpful in order to make sense or try to understand what we can expect with artificial intelligence. And just to pause there for a second, revolutions in military affairs are highly disruptive events that change the way wars are waged. They can be specific technologies, they can be doctrines, they can be a combination of both. Think of the invention of gunpowder, the machine gun, blitzkrieg, nuclear weapons, and most recently, the combination of stealth and precision technologies. All have changed the way in which war is waged, but all in a different way. And what it has led to is that those that have a first mover advantage, that those that are able to harness these revolutions first, they think they have a competitive advantage on the battlefield. And I think that's important to understand because it unpacks some of the dynamics we see when we talk about artificial intelligence. And the question is obviously, is artificial intelligence as such, is that a revolution in military affairs, or do we need to drill down on some of the points that Suzanne also talked about? And when I think about the lessons that I've learned studying revolutions in military affairs, a couple pop out. One is that the evolution of technology has a dynamic of its own, whether we like it or not. There's sort of a fundamental logic why we are seeing the development of and the introduction of artificial intelligence in weapon systems and a move towards increasingly autonomous systems. And ever since in general terms, ever since man emerged from the cave and had conflict with the caveman around the corner, we've tried to put distance between ourselves and that other caveman, whether it was going from clubs to throwing stones, from stones to bow and arrow, from bow and arrow to throwing, to building a gun, to rockets. And in a way, semi-autonomous systems, drones, if you will, or even killer robots, are a logical extension of putting increasing distance between us, who we want to defend, and the other. And so I think that's useful to keep in mind that this technological development has really a momentum of its own. Now, most of the literature focuses on these killer robots or fully autonomous systems, and we'll talk quite a bit about that, I'm sure. I just want to throw out that AI will have implications on international security and on warfare in a very different set of fields. It's worth remembering that the impact of artificial intelligence goes beyond simply warfare and will impact international security. You've talked about cyber, how artificial intelligence has a deep impact on cyber, but also at an even more macro level, the economic dimension of large-scale economic dislocation when we see the large-scale introduction of artificial intelligence in service economies like the Dutch or any Europeans. And this can create instability, which can also, again, be a source of conflict. I think when we look at warfare, however, there's just a couple of points I would raise. artificial intelligence has an opportunity to change what we call the offense-defense balance. So think of the development of gunpowder. It gave an advantage to the attacker. Whereas new engineering technologies, building all those beautiful castles we see in southern France and Italy, gave an advantage to the defender. The question is, what's artificial intelligence going to do? And we talk about the big, perhaps mostly disruptive element being swarming. And swarming is not a new concept. It's something we know, but it's something that can make a magnitude leap with the introduction of artificial intelligence. And what we know from previous revolutions in military affairs, and that's where I'll stop my introductory comments, is that when we see these magnitude leaps emerge, the ones that harness them first think that they are dominant, that they are, have that they introduce an element of primacy. And this is going to be the key question. How does the country or set of countries that think that they've harnessed artificial intelligence to the max, how do they react? Let me give you two historical examples how the United States dealt with this. The United States was the first to harness nuclear weapons. There was a period between 1945 and the mid-1950s where the United States was the only country that had nuclear weapons. On paper, that you could make the argument that the United States was predominant and that therefore we could expect a more belligerent posture. The United States didn't do that. It conditioned itself. Arguably also because there was an internal debate about how nuclear weapons should be used and whether they were actually a tool of leverage that they could deploy. At some point you got parity because the Soviet Union started to develop nuclear weapons of itself. The other example is more recently, is the late 1990s, early 2000s, where the United States believed very strongly, particularly in US defense circles, that through the introduction of stealth technologies, precision munitions, network-centric warfare was the doctrine that was used, that it could defeat any adversary very quickly with minimum casualties. And I very strongly believe that that thinking, that doctrine, but also the conviction that the US was at the leading edge of military technology also made it easier for policymakers to move to, for instance, the decision to invade Iraq. And so the question is, and I'm just putting it here, is are we going to see with the introduction of increasingly autonomous systems, the conditioning effect that we saw in that period after the Second World War, because we were able to discuss what type of weapons we want, whether jus in bello, which was obviously, you know, we're in the peace palace, how that develops, whether international governance can play a role here, or whether we're going to see the late 1990s Iraq War parallel. And I think it's an open discussion which of the two we're going to end up in. Let me leave it here for a second, Tom.
That's terrific. I'm going to go straight on to Tomasz, but particularly to ask you, Tomasz, to comment on how you think this revolution is going to change and challenge the security institutions of the world, and you know, whether it be EU, UN, NATO.
First of all, thanks for the opportunity to address an issue that seems sort of tangential. Why are we talking about artificial intelligence in peace-building conversations? But I think you're already getting a sense of the potential revolutionary impact that artificial intelligence will have on the nature of warfare. And because of that, for the reasons that Rem has just laid out, on the possibility of war, because it is a fact that countries that come into possession of revolutionary new means of warfare have at least the temptation to use it, and how they cope with it is obviously varies greatly, but the fact that AI could bestow this sort of advantage on a narrow group of countries could be potentially destabilizing. I want to address...
Being asked to speak a bit louder.
Yeah, I'm going to continue addressing this, with your indulgence, Tom, this broader issue of the impact of international order, and relative stability among the great powers, before I then come back perhaps later to the issue of on the impact on defense institutions. Because it seems to me the global order is going to be affected in two additional ways beyond the change in the relative military power. The change in relative military power that Suzanne and Rem spoke about matters, but it seems to me two other things come to play, and you've already touched on one, Rem, which is the change in relative prosperity, right? If some countries make a leap in applying artificial intelligence in everyday economy and therefore continue or therefore grow exponentially faster than others, well, it doesn't necessarily follow those countries become more belligerent, but it is an obvious statement of the obvious that if they become significantly richer than others, they have options that others don't. Conversely, poorer countries don't have options and may be losing the options that they have before them today. So how will AI, what impact will artificial intelligence have on the relative prosperity of the big powers? The honest answer is nobody knows. A few people who have looked into that, Accenture is one of them, think that the United States stands to benefit quite significantly and importantly for reasons that are too complicated to lay out here. There is a study out there by Accenture on the impact of AI on economic growth that I urge you to read if you're interested in these issues. But Accenture believes the United States, for reasons having to do with the nature of the economy, the ability to absorb technologies, will benefit greatly. Japan, too, because of the demography, the sort of, mental acceptance of robots in a society. Unhelpfully, Accenture hasn't looked at China. So they have compared developed economies rather than the Chinas of this world. And there's also complete sort of intellectual darkness as to the global south. So the South Africas and others of this world. But it stands to reason, for reasons that Suzanne laid out, that China will be among the most important benefactors of artificial intelligence or the integration of artificial intelligence into the broader economy because of its ability to harness vast amounts of data that it has access to. So hard to tell, how relative prosperity and therefore relative power of the big countries will change. It appears that the relative strength of the United States and China may not change greatly. It appears some new actors, such as Japan, may actually be making sort of a bit of a comeback in terms of being the power player that Japan used to be in the 1980s. Another way the global order will be upended, if you will, or not by artificial intelligence is through the impact that AI may have on the relative stability of the countries. See, military power is one thing, prosperity is another, but in order to actually deploy or make use of both of those, you need to have a modicum of stability. It does you no good if you're in position of powerful technology and prosperous, but you're looking at domestic upheaval, revolts, whatnot. And there, Rem already touched on that, two kind of trend lines appear to be emerging. One is that within the developing societies, the worrying possibility is that as AI comes to be used and applied more widely in the day-to-day economy, a number of us, possibly including the people in this room, will find themselves without a job and without a meaningful possibility of getting one, simply because the sort of things we used to do and specialize in are now done so much better by machines using artificial intelligence. The impact this might have on people's willingness to continue accepting the existing political social order, kind of hard to map out. I mean, obviously this is a source of great concern already. Those people who have looked into the issue realize the dangers and are looking at remedial measures, whether it's universal basic income that might restore at least or retain some sort of a measure of social peace, but the impact on political stability and this sort of durability of the political order within states, really hard to measure out, to sort of project out. Just to state the obvious, even a universal basic income, while giving some sort of a minimum level of comfort, doesn't necessarily buy social peace. Where does the assurance comes from that just because we all get 1,500 euros a month and therefore will not starve, that will not nevertheless strip us of dignity and make us go for a search of another cause that they might justify our lives and our existence now that we no longer can have a meaningful job. So you can easily see how even with universal basic income, radicalization may still follow. So one impact, and on this one impact on the relative stability could be the destabilizing one, where the large amounts of people, they may find themselves unemployed, do upset the existing political order. There is, worryingly, also the possibility that authoritarian states might benefit by avoiding upheaval that they would otherwise run into. What I'm referring to here is the possibility covered, if you have not read it, by a thought-provoking article in Foreign Affairs. Nicholas Wright wrote it, in which he raises the possibility that the assumption we now make about the rising global powers such as India and China in particular, which is that they will eventually have to part with their authoritarian ways, because as the middle classes come to secure a certain level of prosperity, they will start to demand rights, and therefore there will be a political upheaval that China is looking at some point. That assumption may be bogus or rendered irrelevant by artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence will allow authoritarian regimes to do their job much more efficiently than we had previously thought possible. This has to do with the ability to use AI to survey people, and also to use AI to predict people's behavior. You spot the troublemakers by simply analyzing the vast amounts of data you have at your disposal about their day-to-day behavior, and you study deviation from the normal, regular, other people. So that raises a possibility, my very last sentence, Tom, that the assumption that some of us may be making quietly, that perhaps China is obviously a rising global power, but it will never achieve the sort of potential, both in terms of economic power and the military power, that it would achieve if it progressed linearly, because at some point upheaval and unrest will come as the middle classes reach a certain threshold. Perhaps that assumption is bogus. Perhaps AI is the thing that allows authoritarian states to retain in the business of being authoritarian states for much longer. So the relative stability of the global powers and the possibility that they might not be able to use their full military and economic powers will be upended by AI as well.
Thank you very much, Tomasz. Before we open it up a bit, and I do have one question of my own, do you have any brief comments on the remarks that each of you has made? Does anyone want to dissent or disagree or comment?
Well, not to dissent. Actually, I'm sort of inspired by what I've heard, and I just, if I may, just add a footnote to Tomasz's intervention, which is from a military point of view. The United States and generally Western countries have invested heavily in technology to offset a numerical disadvantage. So if you go back over the past 50 years, perhaps even longer, you'll see that there's been this belief attributed that technology can help us remain militarily victorious, to offset either the millions that the Russians could field on the battlefield, or the billions that the Chinese could potentially do. And AI kind of turns that on its head, because arguably numerical numbers are actually at a premium. They actually help you deliver on artificial intelligence, just because the way in which current machine learning works, where you need vast amounts of data. And in that way, this is why I think that particularly in the United States, there is such concern about the Chinese agenda with respect to artificial intelligence, because not only does the United States think that in a way AI could help offset some of the numerical disadvantages that it observes from a conventional point of view, but also that you need actually those large amounts of numbers and that data, and to be able to harness that, which China does in a very authoritarian top-down way through its control of the internet, in its own interpretation of AI. Two final points, very, very quickly, which is it's not just authoritarianism versus liberal democracies. I think companies have an important role to play in this as well. So when we look at where the AI revolution comes from, it doesn't come from central planning agencies in the Ministry of Economic Affairs. It comes from the Googles and the Apples and the Microsofts of this world. And so what you'll also see sort of interspersed in our discussion, because we all think about warfare being something still between states, that companies that are able to really harness the power of artificial intelligence much more effectively than governments can, will also play a role in this broader sort of equilibrium, which is evolving. And I'd just finally point to what we're already seeing happening in financial markets, because we haven't touched upon that. We all talk about driverless cars, we talk about economic dislocation, that none of us is going to have a job in a couple of years, although I tend to believe that think tankers will. But in the financial markets, we see the large-scale introduction of artificial intelligence through algorithms and in quant funds. This already has deeply worrying impacts for us slow, lazy humans that all of a sudden wake up and see, oh my gosh, there's a flash crash in 3 seconds, billions of dollars worth of investment evaporates. And so this is not just something for the future. Some of this is already happening.
2 points super quickly. I meant to make one, but your point on think tankers retaining job
I hope,
or not. Well, actually, it's more than hope. There is a consultancy that looked into that, and yes, I can assure you, think tankers are quite likely to retain their jobs, more likely than others. It has something having to do with the abstract nature of the job being very light on data and facts. On a more serious note, your point on numbers mattering again inspired me to make a bit of a technical point, but potentially important. And just to introduce another layer of complexity, Suzanne spoke of 3 kinds of artificial intelligence: the narrow artificial intelligence, general artificial intelligence, and eventually the super artificial intelligence smarter than humans. There's also within the confines of narrow artificial intelligence, which is what we deal with now. The other 2 domains, as Suzanne said, are music of the future. Even within the confines of narrow artificial intelligence, there's different approaches to skinning this cat, as the Americans say. And the one currently dominant is machine learning, which basically involves crunching huge amounts of data and putting them through a complicated series of networked computers to basically allow the computers to extract trends from large amounts of data. If this continues to be the main and predominant way of the predominant kind of artificial intelligence being used, then yes, the Chinas of this world have an inherent advantage because of access to much greater data sets than any of us in the West can possibly dream of. So that would support the theory that numbers matter. But of course, as Suzanne, who is the most wonkish, if I may so the only scientist, if I don't count political scientists, in a room, will tell us, machine learning is not necessarily the only way going forward. There are other ways of other kinds of artificial intelligence being experimented against. They may come experimented with. They may come to fruition within 5 years or so, that rely on much smaller data sets to actually to draw much more abstract, much broader kinds of artificial intelligence. And if that becomes widely applicable, numbers may cease to matter again, and the advantages all of us currently believe China to be possessing may be negated by this marginal but very important leap in the approach to artificial intelligence.
Suzanne, and you come back on what you've heard so far.
I did want to pick up on one point that Rem had made, and that had to do with the conditioning effect that you see in nations, the debate that goes on about appropriate use. And the Western nations are very well known for having that debate at home. We insist upon having intent when you launch a lethal weapon, right? And that the human is making that decision, and that the human is held accountable for that decision. So there are 2 main things that go into that debate. There's accountability and appropriate use. And we've talked a bit about China. They've set the vision to be the AI leader by 2030, world leader by 2030. Vladimir Putin has made the comment, of course, you've probably all heard it, that whoever leads in this sphere will likely be the ruler of the world And yet, just due to publications, we don't have a lot of visibility on Russia publications, but China and the US are publishing the most, and they appear to be the most advanced. But we have across the board a dozen allies that are really advancing AI. But in the Western allied world, we are constrained, call it a constraint, by the debate at home on appropriate use. But some of our adversaries may not be so constrained, especially if they see military advantage just within the reach. Right? They may not feel terribly constrained. And so I recently read an analytic piece that expressed Russia's recent aggressions, whether it be in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria, as capitalizing on deception, psychological manipulation, and domination of the information domain. And if you can just imagine what they would do with artificial intelligence in those domains, it would be far greater than what they're doing today. And I just wanted to put that thought out there.
Yes, quite a thought. Okay, I do have a question of mine, but this is a conversation, so I'm going to hold that question for a few minutes and take some from the floor. You've got a microphone? Great. So who's going to put up some hands and... Okay, so we've got... why don't we take two at a time to start with? So right in front of you, please do introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Julian. I'm a member of the Carnegie Club of St. Andrews and currently a master's student of technology and also business. And really interesting points that all of you mentioned there. And one thing that I would like to come to in particular was the point about how these magnitude leaps would then put one country or what actor, let's say, in the position of being able to use that as a first mover advantage and be tempted to use it really. But as there's a difference between what, for example, a nuclear weapon was and what AI is, the difference really lies in the fact that AI is digital. And as we know, digital things can be transferred very easily, they can be replicated very easily, they can be copied quite quickly, and at essentially zero cost. So my question would really be, I mean, if we consider AI or like an AI system to be something easily replicable and transportable, wouldn't there also be the possibility that parity between two actors could be reestablished a lot quicker, as it was the case with, for example, the 10 years that it took for the Soviet Union to become like on par with the US? So that would be something that I would find interesting here.
Great, thank you very much for that. And let's keep at the back, right at the back. There's a question here.
Thanks. Zach Dorfman, Carnegie Council. I guess my question is, given the advances that China has been making in this sphere, both AI and big data, and its introduction of a social credit system and its innovative surveillance technologies, I'm wondering if anybody at the panel could talk about the kind of policy-making options that may occur in the future when and if China decides to internationalize those systems and export them abroad.
Great, okay. Who wants to take on?
Well, I can start off on the first one. The second one I don't know, so I'm going to defer to my other co-panelists. It's a very, very interesting question, I think, about the digital replicability of AI and that therefore the balance, the parity might be established sooner. I think it's a fair assumption that that might be the case. I mean, espionage is something that played a role in the Manhattan Project. It's something that'll definitely play a role in sort of the transfer of knowledge about next steps in AI. But I think we have to be precise about what would amount to that first mover advantage. Is it the introduction of artificial intelligence in surveillance systems or in our ability to hack? Or is it what the literature tends to focus on about these killer robots, these fully autonomous systems? And when we talk regarding the latter, just because it attracts so much attention, I think there is a comparability with the nuclear debate after 1944. The reason is the question about control and whether you can still keep control over subsequent responses and counter reactions as a consequence of using, for instance, nuclear weapons on the battlefield will be somewhat similar to the application of fully autonomous weapon systems in, say, the 21st century battlefield. With regard to nuclear weapons, the Americans thought first, hey, this is actually really this is a technology we can also use at the lowest tactical level. We can put it on an artillery shell and use it in any normal conventional armored battle. They quickly realized that that was not what nuclear weapons were for, that they were really strategic weapons, things you use for the last resort, because you have no other options. And I would suspect that in the context of fully autonomous weapon systems, simply because even the one that uses it won't be entirely convinced what kind of results it's going to create. There will be a self-conditioning element to it. In a way, if you want to draw that comparison, it is comparable to the doomsday machine in Dr. Strangelove. Because we simply do not know. Even the Chinese policymaker who might think that this is an excellent idea will not be 100% certain what the cascade effects will be if you unleash fully autonomous systems because of the self-learning capacity that they have. So in a way, I do think, I mean, yes, you're right that probably parity will be created, but I also think that some of the conditioning elements we saw in the nuclear debate are also something that we can expect with respect to fully autonomous systems.
Really quickly, I agree with Rem. I think you're right to say code can be easily stolen, therefore the possibility to replicate should act as an equalizer, but it will, and we have kind of seen that with Stuxnet, you may be familiar with the virus that was used to take out a number of Iranian centrifuges, probably cost millions to develop, but was, because it was, the moment it was released and became available, was immediately replicated and used against us, ironically, a few months later. So in that sense, you're right, except it's not AI, meaning sort of the code itself, that promises to allow countries to make the military or economic leap. It's the integration of AI into either the military technology doctrine or the economy that are the main game changer. So it's not, again, a code that makes promises to revolutionize warfare. It's the ability to make progress in drones, which are becoming ever more sort of self-sustaining. They fly ever longer, ever further, and stay in the air ever longer, with the ability for these drones to communicate securely, hugely important, because if you can disrupt the communication, there is no swarm. And the fact that you can have swarms of these drones not just speaking to each other securely, but learning from each other's experience. So one drone realizes, ooh, the adversary is using this particular kind of electronic warfare, so let me switch to different frequency and immediately impart the lesson to all of those. It's that ability to learn that makes the potential existence and emergence of swarms of drones so powerful. But is it the AI itself? No, it's the combination of drones, communications, computing advances, and AI that makes it possible. So my sense is you can replicate AI, and you can steal and copy some of the code up to a point, but it's the integration thereof into the other walks of life, the economy and the military, that's the game changer, and that's harder to replicate and steal.
Okay, so I just wanted to touch on the policy question, Zach, you asked. That's really difficult for AI because it just blurs the lines between the commercial world and security and defense, and you may sell it as a commercial thing and it's used for an aggressive act. And so I don't believe that our arms control, treaties come into play here, because it's not going to be packaged that way. But if they do actually package it as a weapons system in a lethal way, then it could fall into it. But we don't know what that's going to look like yet.
I'm going to pick up on that very last point, Suzanne, because and given that we're in a peace-building conversation, sitting in the great Hall of Justice, and sort of bring the peace word back into this conversation, and say you've been talking about appropriate use, and so there's an issue of international regulation of abuse of this technology. Would any of you care to speculate what is the appropriate way of means of international regulation? Are we talking about a kind of international UN convention, but then obviously we've got non-state actors involved in the abuse of this system. So what are we talking about, sort of codifying it in the kind of international law that gets regulated in this building by the ICJ? What sort of international conventions are we talking about to sort of ensure that this technology is not abused and is used for peaceful purposes?
I could take it on briefly. I mean, the approach you've just laid out, an international covenant, if you will, to ban autonomous weapon system is the approach being pursued. There is, as you know, as many of you in this room will know, a movement afoot to ban killer robots, for lack of a better term. It hasn't gotten as much traction as many of us who are concerned about the technology would like it to have gotten. I have recently spoken to someone from the campaign to stop killer robots from Human Rights Watch, and I understand only 2 European countries are seriously interested, Austria and the Vatican. Not exactly military powers, great moral powers perhaps. I think Susan's point that about a dozen allied countries, now you didn't specify whether European or not, but presumably many of them European, are developing the technology is the reason why so few of them are interested in a ban. The reality is, frankly, quite a good number of countries, including possibly many, if not most countries represented in this room, are developing the technology themselves. Why do they do that? I mean, are people not concerned about the impact? I guess they are. Every reasonable thinking person would have to be worried. If you're government, however, something else enters into the equation, which is a ban or international agreement to not use the technology a likely possibility in my political lifetime? Because if it isn't, and if you only impose on yourself the voluntary restraint not to use the technology, you might be putting yourself at a potentially lethal disadvantage. And the reality is, when you speak to arms control folks, as I have on the issues, they hold out for better, not for the worse, and it's not for better for the worse, it's for the worse. They hold out little hope of an agreement because, frankly, of the very low levels of faith, trust, and cooperation among the great powers. I mean, to state the obvious, the arms control conversation among Russia and the United States is going nowhere, sadly. If the number of existing treaties that are binding binding the 2 actors in other domains, whether it's intermediate range nuclear forces, whether it's the actual strategic forces, the number of treaties is shrinking, if anything. China hasn't showed any great desire to lead in this area or even to follow the example of others. So sadly for now, my last point, to finish the sentence, sadly for now, the possibility of a global covenant that bans autonomous warfare doesn't seem likely, and until that is the conclusion that many governments come to, they will simply continue and proceed with the technology, because not doing so, they believe, will put them at a unilateral, potentially lethal disadvantage.
So if I can just bring a little bit of the defense perspective into this. I spoke a little bit about the short response time that we have in some of our mission sets, where you need to have artificial intelligence respond faster than a human can respond. And cyber, you all know, moves faster than we can respond. But that's not shooting bullets, okay? But there are a few missions that do require very fast response. There are certain steps in missile defense that require it, and as we're looking to the future, when we're going to be faced with defending ourselves from autonomous swarms that are armed, we need to have almost an equivalent force to address them. So you have to think of, the nations are looking to the future and what they're going to be faced with from adversaries and what they need to have to combat it.
Okay.
And that, just to ram home that point, it will probably take AI to defeat AI. It will take a swarm with fully autonomous systems to defeat it, because the decision cycles are too short.
That's right.
And the machine learning element will probably be too, I don't know, too evolved beyond what we sort of as humans are able to do. Is that a problem, or do you achieve parity in that way? In a way, I think that could be the start of a conversation, once you have that parity. And that's perhaps both the pessimist and the optimist in me. That again, if you look at nuclear weapons, say this is the late 1930s, and all of a sudden a group of people came together and said, well, there's this possibility of splitting the atom and it can unleash tremendous potential, tremendous energy. Let's try to stop it. It's very difficult to stop technological evolution.
Yeah.
Very difficult, if not impossible. After it's been discovered, after it's been used, that's when a conversation gets started. So in a way, I'm pessimistic in terms of the ability of the campaign against killer robots to have any effect. I'm much more optimistic that once we've seen their use and there is an element of parity, and that's when a conversation can get started. But in order to have a fruitful conversation, this is to Thomas's point, and this is, I think, the tragedy that affects our international politics at the moment. You need an international governance system that works. I mean, this doesn't only apply to artificial intelligence, this applies to anything in international relations. And we are, unfortunately, in a moment where, like you say, trust is very low. The UN Security Council isn't really delivering on what it was initially designed to do. We are going through a very difficult patch in terms of international governance. And so these conversations are very difficult to have.
Great, thank you. Now I want to cram in some more questions. So, lady here. Try and be quite brief if you can.
Right, thank you. Fumi Olonishakin from the African Leadership Center at King's College, London.
Sorry, can you introduce yourself? Yeah.
Yes, Fumi Olonishakin, African Leadership Center, King's College, London.
Yeah.
I was very interested in the question here, and I want to build on that. China's ability to strongly develop social credit now and the potential to internationalize it. And many things are happening already informally. The point about AI being integrated with commerce or in this regard intercultural collaboration is taking place already before our very eyes on the continent of Africa. And therefore the question is, what forms of regional alliances would these leading powers need to build in order to shift the world in a different direction towards peace? Because we're still having conversations about what kind of war is possible. But at the same time, there are already habits being formed and the kinds of intercultural competencies being built that can shift the world in one direction or the other. And that will have implications for the UN and global governance. Just your thoughts on that, please.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. Right, next door to you, there's a question.
Thanks. Steve Del Rosso from the Carnegie Corporation in New York. And my question follows somewhat on Fumi's. It seems to me that this first mover advantage, the fact that China and the United States seem to be in the lead right now, would exacerbate the inequalities we see in the world. So I'd like to get a sense of what you think the implications are for the global south of these kind of developments that yet again are taking place among the great powers. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And there's a lady right here.
My name is Cecilia van Pesky, and I was just interested in what you mentioned at the very start of your conversation about enlarging the distance between varying parties, which you of course understand that that's what you're doing as military or multinational organizations. But I was second in command at the Donetsk patrol hub for OSCE for 3 years, and I had the responsibility over the drone team, the UAV team. We lovingly called it our summer drone because it didn't really work with sub-zero level temperatures. But it was a Schiebel copter. What we there also saw is that it really actually brought the varying parties away from each other. It enlarged this distance, but it really also brought the people further away from each other. The distance, the psychological distance became larger. Now, I presume you're not psychologists, I am, but yeah, how do you see this component in AI?
Great, thank you. stop there because, so who wants to take on?
Perhaps I can start with the second question on global inequalities and a global south, while Suzanne and Rem think of clever answers to the other two excellent questions. The short answer is it would be too so facile and easy to assume that the first mover advantage will translate into sort of linear progress for China and the US. We don't know because, and I made that point earlier, too little research exists into the potential impact of AI on the global South's economic prospects. Carnegie Endowment wanted to look at it. Frankly, we're having trouble raising money for the research. It's of no interest to the big companies, which says a lot about the importance they attach to the global South. I think that's a pretty damning thing by itself. But to state the obvious, the assumption that more developed economies are always going to be making better use and more active use of a technology is clearly not borne out by empirical evidence. The way in which mobile telephony has sort of allowed African countries to leapfrog over the inefficiencies in land lines and form business relationship and kinds of commerce that would have probably taken another few decades to form had one waited for proper land infrastructure, optical cable and others to be put in place. That example is already out there. Just recently, I read, those of you in the room who follow these issues closely may correct me, that about a third of the payments in Kenya are now made on a mobile platform. And that system is being used increasingly in Afghanistan, where to get around corruption, simply because once you pay people directly through credits on a mobile phone rather than through cash, you reduce the possibilities of supervisors taking their 30% cuts and only moving on 2/3 of one's salary to the foot soldiers. Those are examples that frankly we could learn from. I failed to get in a gym temporarily this morning because I only brought cash. The gym only took credit cards and it wouldn't recognize my mobile phone, my Apple Pay system. That would have happened to me in Kenya, clearly. So the assumption that, again, the developing economies will always convert the first mover advantage into, and so take it and run away with it, is clearly not borne out by empirical evidence. The real truth is we don't quite know what impact the artificial intelligence will have on the economic prospects of the South, because we don't quite know what sort of new kinds of commerce connections, applications, people in the areas will be able to imagine and envision that we can't. And frankly, nobody has looked into it, at least to my knowledge, as thoroughly as this issue should have been looked into.
Okay, so, no, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not sure I want to touch that one. Although it's very interesting. I mean, we see so many interesting behaviors develop between humans and their smart machines. I mean, you see the attachments that just everyone in this audience has to their mobile phones. It answers every question they have immediately. In the military, we've actually seen those bonds between humans and machines to a point where when they lose it due to an explosion, there's mourning that goes on, true mourning. But I can't speak to the separation between humans. You just know that that's a fact of the development of warfare. From when we went from spears to guns to cannons to missiles, there's a greater separation between you and your enemy. I did want to comment on how this might be used towards peace. And we look at the example of China that's sort of monitoring all of their people, and it's almost a public record on who's good and who's an orderly person and following the laws. And our behavior will change under such a regime as humans, that we will begin to act according to what's approved. We know the eyes are always on us, we're always being tracked, and we want everyone else to think that we're good. And so, I mean, it's just a fundamental fundamental knowledge that people are more likely to act their way into a new behavior than they are to think their way into a new behavior. And so this, this monitoring that's done by a state entity may actually have that effect, that the people know they're being watched and will be more likely act their way into more peaceful behavior.
Yeah, perhaps
But I'm not a psychologist.
a couple of thoughts tangentially related to the questions, which is, while reading up for this panel, I was struck by something I happened upon regarding the step changes in cyber that we can expect with respect to artificial intelligence. And we all focus on new vulnerabilities that can be exploited, hacking. But I just want to raise one point which touches a little bit on the psychology question. I'm enlarging it a little bit, granted, huh? And that's this question of deep fakes that you may have heard of in the reporting. And this I find tremendously worrying. So artificial intelligence is able to assist the creation of images, video, photographs, which are fake, but are almost indistinguishable from from reality. This is not just sort of photoshopping. This is making speeches of Prime Minister Rutte, saying something completely opposite to what he intended, and it is impossible to verify what was real and what was fake. This is going to have a tremendous impact on how we, voters, citizens, deal with the media, deal with our politicians, what we take for true and what we hold for false. And this will just be an exponential continuation of the current debates that we have about post-truth politics. And in my mind, if you sort of extrapolate, I think it's going to fundamentally change the way in which politicians will have to interact with us voters, or the way in which leaders communicate. And that will have real deep impacts on the way our societies function. And this is going to be made possible by very advanced AI-driven software. Now, coming back to the question on Donetsk, you touch upon one of the key dilemmas of the use of military force. Military force should always be the last resort, because you not only create, you're at risk of destroying things, of killing people, harming them, but you also create tremendous distance between the other. And that will make finding resolution much more difficult. But I don't see a way out of this. This is sort of the perennial problem of conflict. At the same time, and this is where I come back to what I said initially, technological development, technological evolution has a momentum of its own. It's not something that you and I can decide to stop because it's bad. It's scientists, it's R&D organizations, it's commercial enterprises. It's that whole fabric that creates prosperity, but also creates the ability to destroy and to create a lack of understanding. So that's... Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. We do only have a few minutes left, and some hands have been going up. Who still wants to ask? Oh my goodness, we've got many more questions, I'm afraid, than we have time for. What I'm going to do is everyone is going to have a one-line question, and then the panel can pick which ones they answer. So starting over here. Yeah.
Patricia Engel, working in the corporate sector. And I was willing to know your motivation and also, of course, above all, your ideas on cooperating with the private sector on artificial intelligence and peace.
Okay, thank you. Behind you.
Yes, I would like to hear your comments on the efforts being done now on privacy and defending privacy rights and GDPR and the relationship between, of course, GDPR and surveillance and GDPR Europe / the world.
Okay, right next to you.
Hello, I'm Eleni Theodoro from the Hague Humanity Hub. My question would be the actual use for good. So we see that UAVs and other data analysis technologies for AI have been used for natural disasters and conflict understanding of the situation. So, you know, analyzing, taking pictures of camps of disasters and use for fast data imagery analysis. So how we can use it for good and really, you know, be on time on response and then resilience.
Terrific.
Yeah.
And in front of you.
Okay, I was just wanting to challenge the issue of increasing remoteness, because if we really are talking about autonomous weapons, then they really are and I'm not saying super intelligent, but are able to make decisions in the field and to act independently, then I see no difference between that and sending an army in. The only issue is you no longer have the jeopardy of the human life of the attacker. And that seems to be a huge qualitative change, that you effectively got an army you can send in without any fear of risk of life, but they are able to contact the enemy just as they would have in the old days, hand-to-hand combat.
Terrific. Over here we've got another small forest of hands as well, but...
I think I'm going to yield to this gentleman who's had his hand up since the beginning.
I'll keep it very short. We've heard you talk about machine learning a few times. We've heard you talk about the necessary quickness of response that will make the human obsolete in the decision-making progress, but I haven't heard you about how we would know what the machine has learned, how the human could actually review it, because robots don't think like people, and how would we actually see what they learned so we might at least correct or have an opinion afterwards?
I spent much of my life teaching military history and national security policy, and I don't know what I teach in the latter area these days. I have, sort of three quickly related little issues. First of all, I do a presentation like this at the Marine War College. How do we define war today? Is North Korea attacking the central bank of Bangladesh an act of war? Is U.S. and Israel disrupting the nuclear capacity of Iran an act of war? Secondly, and this was such a key concept for so long, what on earth does deterrence mean today? Who are we trying to deter? How, the movie Dr. Strangelove was based on the idea there can't be a secret deterrent, but today I'm not sure there can be a public one. We seem to have stumbled into this particular trap as well. And finally, if we ever can reach agreements, what on earth does artificial intelligence do for the issue of verification?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Dmitry, and I'm coming from United Nations of Young Peace Builders. My question is coming from different pieces which already had been told, but like when we talk about the war and AI, we usually say about like drones and these robots and machines and etc. But it might be used in very sophisticated way, like to disrupt other countries, like to destroy the stock market or do some climate changes or nuclear or to set AI make 10,000 viruses a second. So basically it become very sophisticated, and we are not sure that we can control who use this and which way, and so it, like the whole world might be like very chaotic because of this. And also like reflect what you were saying about the distance, that also like the more the distance, the violence increasing also, like what we're doing now with the bombs, it's hardly we could imagine cave people could do with their bare hands, right? So like the violence is really increasing. And
okay, sorry,
yeah,
I'm gonna have...
And my question is, do you think we can like change the perspective of the AI to see it more like to the gift for the humanity than as a danger. Right. Like if you could unite our forces and work on it together, but then use it in a peaceful way, and what could help us to do this? Thank you.
Right. And anyone else? Did you have a? I think we're pretty much out of time. We could clearly talk for another hour, and I'm sorry that we don't have another hour. But just some quick concluding comments. Let's go in the order that we began. So, Suzanne.
Oh, okay. So, two of you hit on the subject of how do we verify that what the machine has learned, and how do we essentially keep it to standards? And that's pure military speak, right? We work on standards, and we test, we verify, we validate that this will perform the functions that it's been set to do. And now we are confronted with this artificial intelligence where it is quickly changing. And so does that mean we have to have a more frequent test, verify, validate cycle? Or does that mean we have to create something new? Are we working in a new paradigm? And I mean, this is certainly something that challenges alliances. If we're talking about being interoperable, what we're bringing into the game has set parameters on what it's going to be able to do, you know, in a mission. But once you bring AI into play, the definition has changed, and it may actually challenge our interoperability, and we'll put that at risk.
These are really tough questions. So two of you asked whether AI can also become a force for good, or whether it can be used for good. And I think definitely it can. And I think we're seeing some of that already. I mean, driverless cars, I think, are something that's going to help us, something that's going to give us the sense that we've made improvements. The question is more at the macro level, can they be a force for peace? And arguably, if we use AI to improve our surveillance capabilities, and it's been mentioned by one of the previous speakers as well, I can't remember who, that if you use surveillance to have, or better surveillance to look at civil conflict, or try to record human rights abuses as they happen, then hopefully we as mankind are smart enough to use that information to set up a system, whether in the UN Security Council or outside it, to do something about it. So better technologies will also help us to deliver on some of the objectives connected to peace. But my fundamental premise is technology is value neutral. Technology can be used for good and it can be used for bad. The parallel here is, remember how in the months leading up to and during the Arab Spring, we all said that social media was going to be the great democratizing force. Look where we are now. Technology is what we all do with it. And so yes, it can be a force for good as it can be a force for destruction. Let me leave it at that.
Great. So Tomasz, you're standing between us and lunch, so a few...
This is where he's delivering on saying that me being his boss means nothing at all, as you can see. Very democratic outfits there, Carnegie Europe. And I will be short, so let me fully align myself with what both Suzanne and Rem have just said. So let me address just super briefly issue of privacy. We Western societies have made a choice, which I fully buy into, that we value our privacy and are cutting back on the access to our personal data. That's the right choice as far as I'm concerned. It is going to put us at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis societies that haven't made the choice, such as China, as long as machine learning, which requires large amounts of data, is the predominant type of artificial intelligence. And lastly, point on actually very briefly point on future wars, not being just bullets, full agreement. We think of the revolution that AI will bring to warfare in terms of AI revolutionizing the traditional bullets, rockets, bombs warfare. But increasingly, war is also denying the adversary the will and the capacity to move, because you threaten such devastating attack on the adversary's, say, healthcare system and hospitals, that the president will decide, I'm going to stay out of this conflict. It's just not worth it. To the extent that AI enables those sort of devastating attacks on critical infrastructure, it has just essentially revolutionized warfare without having to be used in bombs, bullets, or rockets at all. So your point, well taken. In fact, speaking in the tradition of Andrew Carnegie, the next arms control agreement waiting to happen perhaps isn't about using AI to build killer robots. It's about not attacking each other's critical civilian infrastructure. I think that's perhaps even more urgent and pressing task than stopping killer robots. And very last, I am going to be drawn on a psychological debate super briefly. I share the sense that to the extent that AI puts even more distance between the person pulling the trigger and the person being hit by the bullet, it makes war seems colder, more of a mechanical thing, and that is bad because it makes us perhaps more likely to use violence. But equally, there's something about AI that I hope will act as an inhibitor on us using the technology, and that's the sheer unpredictability of what actually happens. The point had been made earlier that we don't quite know what AI does in the course of an operation. It is in the nature of machine learning that the machine learns as it does its thing. It ends up being a somewhat different algorithm, somewhat different machine by the end of the operation. That it introduces an element of uncertainty that I, as a former ambassador at NATO, would be very uncomfortable with when approving an AI-executed military mission. So I'm hoping that they will inhibit people from using it nilly-willy, because you don't quite know what you're getting into. And very last point, Rem said earlier that it will probably take AI to defeat AI. He's absolutely right. Because of the speed involved, you will be forced to counter AI with more AI, but that just increases the possibility exponentially of things going pear-shaped, because two AI systems interacting is going to make for the probability that we may end up in a very different place and situation from the one envisioned by architects of either of the systems even more likely. So yes, AI will psychologically, I guess, could make the politicians more willing to use force, because more distance equals less emotional distress. That's not good. But equally, the fact that it's such an unpredictable technology by its very nature, I hope will inhibit us from using it nilly-willy.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Tomasz. We are out of time, in fact, over time, but it's been a great discussion and in a great hall. Thank you so much for coming, and in particular, let's thank our panelists.